Hi, I've gotten a couple of emails from people who are thinking about what would be the best way for me to collect a language sample for my student. And really, there are a lot of scenarios, but you have to remember what your goal is. You really want to understand the student's form. And of course, we have form through oral communication. We have form through sign language and the use of ASL or some form of sign language. And then we have written communication. So we've got all those three possibilities, and it really depends upon the age of the child and what your goals are, what you want to learn. But the purpose is important. It's all about structure or form. You want to know what form the student is using. What do they know? What are they competent at? You want to know what they don't know, but they should know. So what's the next developmental step? If they have this, where am I going to go for that next step? You want to think about what they need to know in terms of their academic setting. What are some of the structures or the forms that they actually need to use in order to be successful? And keeping an eye out as well for the forms that they're using that are not contributing to their intelligibility. So if they are using really forms that are difficult to interpret, that's a problem. You've got to kind of address that. So let's think about some of the scenarios. Nick was one scenario. We looked at Nick's communication, his oral communication, and we did it by collecting a language sample through a retelling, using the tassel, the levels, looking at the sentence structure and the syntactic elements, and then making some predictions based on what we learned about where we want him to go. The second scenario is I know that I have asked you to use writing, but what about the young child who is not writing sentences in English, so it's challenging. You just don't have the sample because they're not there developmentally. So one scenario is for you to collect a sample, much like Nick's sample, but over the course of the day, where you really collect the student's oral communication, targeting really the most complex sentences that you hear them, or the most complex structures that you hear, so that you can really get a good sense of where they are developmentally. And you write it down, and then you analyze it using the tassel. That actually was what the original purpose for the tassel was. What about the young child who is using American Sign Language or using some form of developing sign? Again, they're not writing in English, but they are beginning to develop form, and you're as concerned about their form as you are the child who's using oral English. And so you can do the same thing by collecting a sample of their communication, again targeting what seems the most complex that they're doing, the most structure, get good variations in the kinds of structures that they're using, and then analyze them. You could use the early level of tassel because, frankly, a lot of the same forms in early English, if you're looking at two signs, look kind of the same. But you also have in starting with assessment, I'm looking for it, you have what is called on page 48, stages of language development, and really focusing on sign language. So what you really want to look at are some of the form characteristics. And in particular, for example, on page 47, some of the early forms are subject verb, verb object, subject verb object, verb location, subject verb location. Some of those early 2 and 3 sign productions. And so and there are some other expressive language form characteristics, but those are really some of the basic ones. So you could collect a sample, and then instead of using the tassel, you could use those very early sentence forms to analyze your students' communication, because it tells you what you have to do next and begin building on that. If the child, a third scenario that would be for a child who is using writing, but their English writing, they're primarily using ASL in their through-the-air communication, but their English writing is pretty hard to analyze and break down. And so I was just talking with Gabby, who has an older child who really reflects this scenario. So you have a written sample. It would be, you are going to either have to kind of make sense of it yourself, what did they mean, or better yet, talk with the student and find out what they were trying to communicate. And then you want to write what they wrote. Think about how you would write it in English if they were to write it in English. What would be one of the most efficient forms? And that way you can begin to think about where you need to go. And I would use the tassel for this because you are primarily targeting English. And so if you have a child who is sort of mixing syntactic components around, but they may have actually a subject, a verb, and an object, well, you really are on level 2 or level 3 of tassel. And that's going to really be your goal, is to work that student toward a form that really communicates what they are trying to communicate. Often the written language sample looks very much like ASL, sort of a topic comment structure. But in written language, we want them to use English. And so that's what we have to get them closer to. And then there are a lot of students who are just writing and who are making a lot of, they're developing English, but they may or may not be developing complex forms in English. And so you find the level at which they're functioning, and then you also look carefully at the syntactic elements they include, or perhaps the ones that they're making errors with that interfere with their intelligibility. For the alternative, if you choose to do the alternative because you have a very young child, I give you a sample that you could in fact, let's see, what do I say? Alternative, analyze 10 of the sentences from the sample. But then I want you to then, for your very young children, to look at a written language, look at their developmental writing. So it's not going to be a sample, it's developmental writing. And this link, which doesn't link, you'll have to put it in your browser, actually gives us, let's see, I had it in my browser. Let's see if it's behind here. Here we go. So with very young children, hopefully you are working with them on drawing, talking about their drawings, beginning to make that connection between through-the-air communication and written communication. And so this is really a description of developmental writing stages, where you see emerging really being just pictures and possibly trying to imitate some letter formation. But one of the easiest ways to start is to take what they do produce, ask them what it means, and take dictation and write on the sample what they are talking about. So you look at the developmental sample, and then you have them tell you about the pictures so that you get some, again, it's a language sample, certainly about something they just produced. But young children should, in fact, be at some stage of developmental writing. And if you're at this point, you're doing a language sampling analysis. But if you're at these early stages where they're just really not producing English, and you have a very young child, look at their early written communication. have them dictate and write what they are trying to communicate, and use that as part of a language sample. So tell me about the development, where they are in written language, and then analyze what they do tell you about the picture. And it may just be one word. It may just be labeling some of these. So that you have lots of options. That's sort of the complexity of all of this, is that children are very different, but you have to keep in mind what your goal is. Your goal is to understand the student's form. And when they are capable of written English, you want, in this particular activity, I'm asking you to look at their written language form. If they cannot produce written language form, and they're very young, then you have the alternative, which is to look at their developmental writing and what they dictate as your sample, and then also analyze 10 of the sentences in the alternative sample that I provide you. So I hope this helps, and if you have any questions, please let me know.